In October 1929, a Wall Street banker named Winston Churchill stood on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange and watched men jump from windows. Just weeks earlier, these same men had been millionaires. They had servants, mansions, and entire floors of skyscrapers with their names on the door. Now they were choosing death over bankruptcy. How did we get here? The answer lies in the greatest party in American history. A decade so wild, so reckless, and so deceptively glamorous that we're still lying to ourselves about what it really was. This is the true story of the Roaring Twenties, and I need to warn you, everything you think you know about it is probably wrong. The Age of Miracles, the World After the War, January 1st, 1920. The calendar flips to a new decade, and America wakes up to a world that would have been unrecognizable just 10 years earlier. The Great War is over. 16 million soldiers are dead in Europe. But somehow, impossibly, America has emerged richer and more powerful than ever before. Let's understand what actually happened. During World War I, while Europe tore itself apart, American factories ran 24 hours a day, feeding the Allied war machine. By 1918, the United States had transformed from a debtor nation into the world's largest creditor. European countries owed America over $10 billion, money they would never fully repay. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was a psychological transformation. Americans believed they had discovered the secret formula for permanent prosperity. Mass production plus mass consumption equals infinite wealth. It was intoxicating. It was also completely delusional. The decade exploded with change. Women had just won the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. The flapper emerged, young women who smoked, drank, danced, and horrified their parents by cutting their hair short and raising their hemlines above the knee. This wasn't just fashion, it was rebellion. Born in the African-American communities of New Orleans, was spreading across the nation like wildfire, driving a moral panic among cultural conservatives who called it the devil's music. The Lost Generation writers, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Dos Passos, were documenting a generation's disillusionment with traditional values. But the real story was happening in the factories. Henry Ford's assembly line had revolutionized manufacturing. A car that took 12 hours to build in 1912 could now be assembled in just 93 minutes. This wasn't just faster production, it was a complete reimagining of industrial capitalism. Electricity was transforming everything. In 1920, only 35% of American homes had electric power. By 1930, it was 68%. This meant refrigerators instead of ice boxes, electric irons instead of heated metal, and radios that could bring the world into your living room. So here's what we're going to unpack in the next 2 hours. What did it actually cost to live in this legendary decade? Not in vague romantic terms, but in real dollars and cents. What did you need to survive in a tenement? To join the middle class? To live like Gatsby? And more importantly, why did it all collapse? Because make no mistake, this wasn't a random crash. The Great Depression wasn't bad luck or bad weather. It was the inevitable result of a decade of deliberate economic choices. And understanding those choices might be the most important economic lesson in American history. Here's what the history books don't tell you about the Roaring Twenties. For 4 out of every 10 Americans, it didn't roar. It growled, it threatened, and it kept them up at night worrying about next week's rent. Let's start with the cold, hard math. In 1925, an unskilled factory worker, someone working in a meatpacking plant, a textile mill, or on a construction site, earned approximately $25 per week. That's $1,300 per year. In 2025, adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $23,000 annually. Now, before you say, that doesn't sound so bad, let me break down what that money actually bought you, and more importantly, what it didn't. Let's take the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the world. In 1925, you could rent a 3-room cold water flat for about $25 a month. That's $300 a year, or roughly 23% of your annual income. What did you get for that money? A room for sleeping, a room for living, and a tiny kitchen with a coal stove. No central heating. You burned coal in winter and sweltered in summer. No hot water. You heated water on the stove for washing. The toilet was in the hallway, shared with 3 or 4 other families. Privacy was a luxury you couldn't afford. These buildings were called dumbbell tenements because of their shape, designed to squeeze as many families as possible into a single lot. Windows in the interior rooms opened onto narrow air shafts, so dark and airless that they were called the lungs of the city. But they weren't bringing in fresh air. They were recycling disease, cooking smells, and desperation. Food consumed another massive chunk of the budget. For a family of 4, you'd need roughly $10 to $12 per week just for basic groceries. Let me show you what that bought. Milk, 14 cents per quart, you'd need 2 to 3 quarts per week. Bread, 9 cents per loaf, maybe 4 to 5 loaves per week. Eggs, 55 cents per dozen. Butter, 55 cents per pound. Potatoes, 4 cents per pound. Your primary food source. Pork chops, 40 cents per pound, a weekend luxury. Chicken, 35 cents per pound, rare treat. Sugar, 10 cents per pound. Coffee, 45 cents per pound. Notice what's missing. Fresh vegetables, fruit, any kind of variety. The working class diet was designed for one thing: maximum calories at minimum cost. You ate to survive, not to enjoy. Malnutrition-related diseases, rickets, scurvy, pellagra, were common in urban tenements. But food and rent weren't your only expenses. You needed coal for heating and cooking, $5.07 per month in winter, kerosene for lamps, $1 to $2 per month. Electricity was too expensive. Clothing, maybe $50 to $75 per year for the entire family, mostly hand-me-downs and repairs. Transportation, 5 cents per subway or trolley ride, walking was cheaper. Medical care, pay as you go, which meant you didn't go unless you were dying. Let's do the math. After rent, food, fuel, and basic necessities, you had maybe $10 to $15 per month left over. And that had to cover everything else. Shoes when yours wore out, medicine when the kids got sick, a few cents for entertainment on Saturday night. Here's what makes this so brutal. There was no safety net. None. No unemployment insurance if you lost your job. No Social Security if you got too old to work. No disability payments if you got injured. No health insurance if you got sick. No workers' compensation if you got hurt on the job. And workplace injuries were horrifyingly common. If you couldn't work, you relied on 3 things: family, charity, or starvation. That's not an exaggeration. That's the economic reality of the Roaring Twenties for the bottom 40%. This poverty had a face, and that face was often black or immigrant. The 1920s saw 6 million African Americans flee the Jim Crow South in what historians call the Great Migration, moving to northern cities in search of factory jobs and freedom from racial terror. They found the jobs. The freedom, not so much. They were packed into segregated neighborhoods, paid lower wages than white workers doing identical work, and faced constant discrimination. A black factory worker might earn $20 per week when his white counterpart earned $30. Meanwhile, new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe had been effectively shut down by the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924, which established racist quotas designed to keep America white and Protestant. But the immigrants already here, Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, crowded into the same tenements, working the same brutal jobs. Here's a statistic that should shock you. If you were born into a working-class family in 1920, your life expectancy was about 53 years. If you were born into an upper-class family, it was 63 years. 10 years of life bought with money. Infant mortality in poor urban neighborhoods was over 100 deaths per 1,000 live births, 10 times higher than it is today. Tuberculosis, the white plague, killed over 100,000 Americans per year, mostly the poor living in cramped, unsanitary conditions. So when someone tells you the Roaring Twenties was a golden age, ask them, for whom? For the bottom 40% of Americans, it was a decade of grinding poverty, constant insecurity, and early death. They built the skyscrapers, assembled the cars, and stitched the fancy clothes. But they lived in the shadows of the prosperity they created. But here's where the 1920s gets interesting. Because while the poor stayed poor, something genuinely new was happening in the middle. For the first time in human history, a large segment of the population was earning enough money not just to survive, but to buy things they wanted, not just things they needed. This was the birth of the modern consumer economy. And it would change everything. Let's define our terms. In the mid-1920s, a solidly middle-class income ranged from about $2,500 to $4,000 per year. This included skilled factory workers, machinists, foremen, electricians, $2,500 to $3,000 a year. Office workers, bookkeepers, secretaries, clerks, $2,000 to $2,800 a year. Salesmen and small business owners, $3,000 to $4,000 a year. Teachers and nurses, $1,800 to $2,500 a year. Junior managers and professionals, $3,500 to $5,000 a year. In today's money, we're talking about $45,000 to $72,000 per year. Comfortable, but not wealthy. Enough to participate in the new consumer culture, but not enough to be secure. The symbol of middle-class arrival wasn't a house. It was a car. And not just any car, but Henry Ford's Model T, the first automobile designed for the masses. Here's what made the Model T revolutionary. In 1908, when it was first introduced, it cost $850, nearly a year's wages for a skilled worker. But Ford's assembly line drove the price down relentlessly. By 1916, it was $360. By 1925, a brand new Model T touring car cost just $290. Think about what that meant. For the price of about 6 weeks' wages, a middle-class American could buy personal transportation, freedom, mobility, status. No wonder Ford sold over 15 million Model Ts between 1908 and 1927. But here's what the advertisements didn't tell you. The car itself was just the beginning. You also needed gasoline, about 21 cents per gallon. You'd use 10-15 gallons per week. Motor oil, 35 cents per quart, changed every 500 miles. Tires, $12 to $15 each. They wore out constantly on rough roads. Repairs, frequent and expensive. Cars broke down constantly. License and registration, $2 to $5 per year. Insurance, about $40 to $60 per year. The total cost of car ownership was roughly $500 to $700 per year, about 20% of your middle-class income. But people paid it gladly. The car was freedom incarnated. With a middle-class income, you could afford to leave the tenement behind. A comfortable apartment or small house in a decent neighborhood with electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating cost about $60 to $75 per month to rent, or $8,000 to $2,000 to buy. Let me paint you a picture of a typical middle-class home in 1925. You're in a 3-bedroom apartment in Queens or Cleveland or Pasadena. It has electric lights in every room, no more kerosene lamps, a gas stove for cooking, no more coal stove, a private bathroom with hot running water, luxury, central heating from a basement boiler, maybe a small backyard or a shared courtyard, hardwood floors and plaster walls, large windows that actually let in light. And now you could fill that home with the marvels of modern technology. This is where the consumer revolution really exploded. Consider the radio, $75 to $150. The radio was the centerpiece of middle-class life. For the first time, you could hear live music, news, comedy shows, and sports without leaving your living room. By 1929, over 10 million American homes had a radio. Families would gather around it like a hearth, listening to Amos and Andy, broadcast concerts, and presidential addresses. The vacuum cleaner, $45 to $75. Before the vacuum cleaner, you beat rugs by hand or swept with a broom. Back-breaking, constant work. The electric vacuum was liberation in a machine. The washing machine, $80 to $150. This might have been the most revolutionary appliance of all. Laundry day had traditionally meant an entire day of heating water, scrubbing by hand, wringing and hanging to dry. A washing machine cut that to a few hours. Women's time. Suddenly, it had value. The refrigerator, $300 to $500. The electric refrigerator was the most expensive and most desirable appliance. Before refrigeration, you had an ice box. Literally, a box with a block of ice in it that melted and had to be replaced every few days. A refrigerator meant food lasted longer, shopping was less frequent, and ice cream could be stored at home. By 1930, only about 8% of homes had one. It was still a luxury item. Now here's the question. How did middle-class families afford all this on $2,500 to $3,000 per year? The answer is simple and ominous. They borrowed. Consumer credit. Buy now, pay later. was invented in the 1920s. Before this decade, debt was shameful, something to be avoided except for buying a house or land. But in the 1920s, debt was rebranded as installment buying, and it became not just acceptable, but fashionable. The pitch was seductive. Why wait? You deserve this now. Just $1 down and $5 per month. A radio for $1 down. A vacuum cleaner for $2 down. A car for $50 down and $30 per month. Suddenly, the middle-class life was available to anyone with a steady job. Let's look at the explosion of consumer debt. 1920, about 15% of goods sold on credit. 1925, about 60% of goods sold on credit. 1929, about 75% of all cars and 50% of all major appliances sold on installment plans. By 1929, Americans owed about $7 billion in consumer installment debt, roughly 10% of the entire GDP. For context, that's equivalent to $3 trillion today. This was completely unprecedented. An entire economy was being built on the assumption that tomorrow would always be better than today, that jobs would always be secure, that income would always rise. But what happens when tomorrow isn't better? What happens when the jobs disappear? We'll find out soon enough. With a middle-class income, you could also afford leisure. This was new. For the first time, ordinary people had time and money for entertainment. Movie tickets cost about 25 cents for adults, 10 cents for kids. Middle-class families went once or twice a week. The movies were silent until 1927, but they were spectacular. Grand palaces with orchestras, newsreels, cartoons, and feature films that transported you to other worlds. Baseball was America's pastime. A seat at a Yankees game cost 50 cents to $1.50. Boxing matches were major events. When Jack Dempsey fought Gene Tunney in 1927, over 100,000 people paid to watch, and millions more gathered around radios. The middle class could afford to eat out occasionally. A meal at a modest restaurant cost about 50 to 75 cents. A fancy dinner at a good restaurant might be $2 to $3 per person. The 1920s was also the decade when personal appearance became a consumer product. The cosmetics industry exploded. Women who had never worn makeup before were suddenly buying. Lipstick would cost anywhere between 50 cents to $1. Face powder, 50 cents to $2. Perfume, $2 to $10 per bottle. For men, the ready-made suit became standard. A decent suit cost $30 to $50. A good one, $75 to $100. You were expected to own at least two, one for work, one for Sundays. So yes, the middle class was living better than any generation before them. They had cars, appliances, entertainment, and leisure time. But look closely at the foundation. It was all built on debt, on installment payments, on the assumption that nothing would ever go wrong. These families were living month to month, payment to payment. If someone lost their job, the car would be repossessed within 60 days. The furniture would go back to the store. The radio would be taken. This wasn't prosperity. It was a high-wire act without a net. And in 1929, the wire was about to snap. Let's talk about the parts of the Roaring Twenties that don't make it into the Gatsby parties and flapper dresses. Because behind the glamour was a decade of spectacular hypocrisy, organized violence, and genocidal hatred. The 1920s wasn't just economically unstable, it was morally bankrupt. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal throughout the United States. This was prohibition, the noble experiment that would make America sober, productive, and moral. It was an instant catastrophic failure. Here's what prohibition actually did. It created the largest criminal enterprise in American history. The demand for alcohol didn't disappear, it just went underground. And where there's demand, there's money. Let's look at the numbers. Before Prohibition, Americans consumed about 2.5 gallons of alcohol per person per year. During Prohibition, estimates suggest consumption dropped to maybe 2 gallons per person, a reduction, but not elimination. The difference? Now every drink was illegal, and every dollar spent went to criminals instead of legitimate businesses. New York City had about 30,000 speakeasies by 1925, twice as many as the number of legal bars before Prohibition. A typical speakeasy might serve 200 customers per night, charging $1 to $2 per drink. The king of this criminal empire was Al Capone. At his peak in 1927, Capone's organization was earning an estimated $100 million per year, about $1.7 billion in today's money, from bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and extortion. Capone essentially ran Chicago. He had police officers, judges, and politicians on his payroll. He provided a service people wanted, alcohol, but he enforced his monopoly with incredible violence. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where Capone's men machine-gunned 7 rivals, was just the most famous example of daily brutality. Here's the sick irony. Prohibition was supposed to reduce crime and improve public health. Instead, it created organized crime as a permanent feature of American life, poisoned thousands with tainted bootleg liquor, and filled the prisons with otherwise law-abiding citizens whose only crime was wanting a drink. And the hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same politicians who voted for prohibition drank at private clubs. The same police officers who raided speakeasies were on the payroll of bootleggers. The same judges who sentenced small-time offenders owned shares in rum-running operations. Prohibition taught Americans a dangerous lesson. Laws are optional if you're rich or connected enough. This cynicism toward government authority would poison American politics for generations. Now let's talk about the most disturbing aspect of the 1920s, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan of the 1920s wasn't a fringe group meeting in backwoods clearings. It was a mainstream mass membership organization that, at its peak in 1924-1925, had between 4 and 6 million members. That's roughly 5% of the adult white population of the United States. The Klan wasn't just burning crosses, it was electing governors, senators, and controlling entire state legislatures. Indiana's governor, Edward Jackson, was a Klansman. Oregon, Oklahoma, Texas, and other states had powerful Klan political machines. In 1924, the Klan nearly controlled the Democratic National Convention. What did they want? White supremacy, Protestant Christianity, and the elimination of anyone who didn't fit their definition of 100% American. Their targets were African Americans, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and anyone who supported racial equality or integration. Here's something disturbing. The KKK was also a profitable business. Members paid $10 to join, about $170 today, plus annual dues. With millions of members, that's tens of millions of dollars flowing to the organization and its leaders. The Klan sold robes, sold life insurance to members, and organized massive rallies where they sold food, souvenirs, and propaganda. In 1925, the Klan organized a march in Washington, D.C. that drew 40,000 robed members. They marched openly, proudly, down Pennsylvania Avenue, past the White House, while President Coolidge did nothing. And behind the political theater was constant terrorism. Between 1920 and 1929, hundreds of African Americans were lynched, hanged, burned alive, tortured to death by white mobs, often with Klan involvement. Thousands more were beaten, driven from their homes, or threatened into silence. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 was the most infamous example. A white mob, backed by the Klan, burned the prosperous black neighborhood of Greenwood to the ground, killing an estimated 300 people and destroying over 1,200 homes. It was domestic terrorism on an unimaginable scale. The Klan's influence culminated in the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924, which essentially closed America's borders to anyone who wasn't from Northern or Western Europe. The 1924 Act established quotas designed to preserve America's racial composition, explicitly racist legislation that wouldn't be overturned until 1965. So when you see those glamorous images of the Roaring Twenties, the parties, the jazz, the excitement, remember this. It was also the decade of Al Capone and the KKK, of bootleggers and lynchings, of spectacular hypocrisy and genocidal hatred. The moral rot at the center of the 1920s would contribute to its collapse. You can't build a sustainable society on organized crime and systemic racism. The chickens would come home to roost. Now we get to the heart of the matter, the stock market. This is where the prosperity of the 1920s was manufactured, packaged, and sold to the American people. And it was all a lie. Before the 1920s, the stock market was a rich man's game. In 1920, maybe 2 to 3 million Americans owned stocks. By 1929, that number had exploded to over 10 million, nearly 10% of the population. Why? Because Wall Street discovered it could sell stocks to ordinary people using the same tool that was selling cars and radios: credit. It was called buying on margin, and it was legalized gambling with borrowed money. Here's how it worked. Let's say you wanted to buy $1,000 worth of stock in 1928. Under margin rules, you only needed to put down $100 to $200 of your own money. The broker would lend you the rest at 8 to 12% interest. Now, if the stock went up 20%, you'd make $200 profit on your $100 investment, a 200% return. You were a genius. You'd pay back the broker and do it again with a bigger bet. But if the stock went down 20%, you'd lose your entire $100, still owe the broker money, and receive a margin call demanding you pay up immediately, or they'd sell your stock at a loss. This created a feedback loop of pure insanity. More buyers meant rising prices. Rising prices attracted more buyers. By 1928 to 1929, the stock market had completely detached from reality. Look at these numbers. The Dow Jones Industrial Average in January 1925, 120 points. The Dow in January 1928, 200, a 67% increase. The Dow in September 1929, 381, another 90% increase. In less than 5 years, the stock market had tripled. Were companies 3 times more valuable? Were profits 3 times higher? No, it was pure speculation. Buying stocks because you believed someone else would pay more tomorrow. And the game was rigged. Wealthy investors and insiders used stock pools to manipulate prices. Here's how it worked. A group of wealthy men would quietly buy up a stock, driving up the price. Then they'd plant favorable stories in newspapers, hire promoters to tout the stock, and create artificial trading volume to attract attention. Small investors would see the rising price and jump in. Once enough suckers were on board, the pool members would sell their shares at the peak, pocketing massive profits, and leave the small investors holding worthless stock as the price collapsed. This was legal. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission, no insider trading laws, no disclosure requirements. It was legalized fraud. The result was obscene inequality. Let's look at the numbers. In 1929, the top 1% of Americans controlled 44% of all wealth. The top 0.1% controlled 20% of all wealth. The richest 60,000 families had as much wealth as the poorest 25 million families. Think about that. 60,000 families, fewer people than attend a typical college football game, owned as much as 25 million people combined. This wasn't prosperity, it was concentration. By 1928, smart economists were sounding alarms. The Federal Reserve was worried. Even some business leaders warned that stock prices were unsustainable. But nothing could stop it. When you could double your money in months, why would you listen to warnings? When your neighbor was making a fortune, why would you sit on the sidelines? It was the greater fool theory in action. It doesn't matter if something is overvalued as long as you can sell it to a greater fool tomorrow. Let me tell you about some real people. There was a shoe salesman in Cleveland who borrowed against his house to buy stocks. When the market crashed, he lost the house, his life savings, and eventually his job when the Depression hit. These weren't stupid people. They were ordinary Americans told by newspapers, by magazines, by respected business leaders that the stock market was the path to prosperity. They believed the lie. The stock market of the 1920s wasn't a market at all. It was a casino where the house always won. It funneled wealth from the many to the few, from the naive to the insiders, from Main Street to Wall Street. And when it collapsed, as every bubble eventually does, it would take the entire economy down with it. Because you can't sustain an economic system where wealth generation is disconnected from actual production. Eventually, reality reasserts itself. And in 1929, reality came crashing back with a vengeance. At the top of this pyramid sat the truly wealthy. Not the middle class with their installment plan radios. Not even the upper middle class professionals. I'm talking about the millionaires, the tycoons, the Gatsby class. Let's see what it actually cost to live the dream. To be considered wealthy in the 1920s. To live the life depicted in. By 1929, there were approximately 30,000 families in America with incomes over $50,000. That's about 0.1% of the population. These were the gods of the new American economy. Let's start with the house. Not a home, a mansion. The truly wealthy lived in grand estates in places like Long Island's Gold Coast, Connecticut's Greenwich, or Manhattan's Upper East Side. A mansion on Long Island could cost anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000 to build. That's $1.8 million to $9 million today. But the real Gatsby-level estate? Think $1 million or more. The Woolworth Mansion, for example, cost over $5 million in 1916. Or you could rent a luxury penthouse on Park Avenue for $5,000 to $10,000 per year, more than 3 times the entire annual income of a middle-class family, just for rent. A mansion required staff, lots of staff. A typical wealthy household employed a butler, $1,500 to $2,000 a year plus room and board. A cook, $1,000 to $1,500 a year, a maid or two, $600 to $800 a year each. A chauffeur, $1,200 to $1,800 a year. A gardener, $1,000 to $1,500 a year. Perhaps a personal secretary, $2,000 to $3,000 a year. Total staff costs, ranging from $8,000 up to $15,000 per year. That's the equivalent of employing 5 middle-class families. The wealthy didn't just live differently, they lived in a parallel universe where other human beings existed primarily to serve them. While the middle class drove Model Ts, the wealthy drove Duesenbergs, Packards, Pierce Arrows, and imported Rolls-Royces. These weren't transportation, they were rolling declarations of superiority. A Duesenberg Model J, the ultimate status symbol, cost $13,000 to $20,000 for the chassis alone. Before you paid a custom coach builder another $5,000 to $10,000 to build the body. Fashion was a competitive sport among the wealthy. For men, a bespoke suit from a top tailor cost $200 to $500. You'd need a dozen. For women, it was even more extravagant. A single dress from a Paris couturier could cost $500 to $2,000. A fur coat, $3,000 to $10,000. Jewelry from Cartier or Tiffany, tens of thousands. The truly wealthy spent $10,000 to $50,000 per year just on clothing and accessories. And then there were the parties. The Gatsby parties. Real wealthy hosts in the 1920s would spend $5,000 to $20,000 on a single party. The legendary parties of the 1920s, the ones that made it into the society pages and the novels, cost more than most Americans earned in a decade. They were displays of power masquerading as entertainment. The wealthy traveled constantly. A first-class ticket on an ocean liner to Europe cost $500 to $1,500 each way. A month-long European grand tour, $5,000 to $10,000 per person. The wealthy thought nothing of spending $20,000 to $30,000 per year on travel, money that could have supported 100 working-class families. They belonged to exclusive clubs with membership fees of $1,000 to $5,000 per year. They kept vacation homes in Newport, Palm Beach, or the Adirondacks. They owned yachts, racehorses, and art collections. Here's what's crucial to understand. The wealthy of the 1920s lived in a completely separate reality from everyone else. They didn't just have more money, they inhabited a different world with different rules, different values, and different consequences. When the stock market was manipulated, they were the manipulators. When Prohibition banned alcohol, they had private cellars and connections to the best bootleggers. When workers demanded higher wages, they crushed unions. When taxes threatened their wealth, they hired lawyers to find loopholes. Who were these people? Some were old money, Astors, Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, families who had been wealthy for generations. But many were new rich, the Wall Street speculators and industrial magnates who had made fortunes in the boom. There was Charles Schwab, the steel magnate, who built a 75-room mansion on Riverside Drive that cost over $7 million. There was William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon, who built the legendary Hearst Castle and spent $200,000 per year just maintaining his art collection. These were the real Gatsbys, and just like Fitzgerald's character, their wealth was often built on speculation, luck, and timing, rather than actual creation of value. But here's the dark secret about Gatsby-level wealth in the 1920s. Much of it was an illusion. It was paper wealth, stock portfolios that looked impressive on paper, but would vanish overnight when the market crashed. It was borrowed money, mortgages on mansions, loans against stock portfolios, credit extended based on the assumption that tomorrow would always be richer than today. When the crash came, some of these millionaires would discover they were actually bankrupt. The mansions would be foreclosed. The cars would be sold at auction. The servants would be dismissed. The party would be over. October 1929. The month when the music stopped, the lights came on, and America woke up with the worst hangover in history. This wasn't just a stock market crash. It was the moment when an entire economic system revealed itself as a fraud. Let's rewind to summer 1929. The party was still raging, but cracks were appearing. In June, industrial production started to decline. In July, consumer spending began to slow. In August, some of the smartest investors, the insiders, began quietly selling their stock holdings. But the newspapers were still bullish. In September, the economist Irving Fisher famously declared that stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau. It was possibly the worst-timed prediction in economic history. October 24, 1929, Black Thursday. The day started with a wave of sell orders. Investors who had bought on margin were receiving margin calls, demands to pay up or see their stocks sold. But they couldn't pay up, so the brokers sold, which drove prices down, which triggered more margin calls, which led to more selling. By 11 a.m., the market was in free fall. The ticker tape, the machine that reported stock prices, couldn't keep up. It was running 2.5 hours behind, which meant investors didn't even know how much they were losing. At 12:30 p.m., a group of powerful bankers met at the offices of J.P. Morgan & Company. They decided to intervene, pooling $240 million to buy stocks and stabilize the market. It worked, temporarily. The market recovered somewhat by the end of the day. But the damage was done. 12.9 million shares had been traded, a record. Billions of dollars in paper wealth had evaporated. And everyone knew this wasn't over. The weekend brought no relief. On Monday, October 28th, the selling resumed with a vengeance. The Dow dropped 13% in a single day, the largest one-day percentage decline in history up to that point. Another 9.2 million shares traded. The bankers who had intervened on Thursday couldn't stop the flood. And then came Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the day the world ended. 16.4 million shares traded, a record that would stand for 40 years. The Dow dropped another 12%. The ticker tape didn't finish reporting the day's transactions until 7:45 p.m., more than 4 hours after the market closed. But the real horror wasn't in the numbers. It was in the scenes on Wall Street. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange in eerie silence. Rumors spread of suicides, some true, most false. Police were called to maintain order. Inside the exchange, traders screamed themselves hoarse trying to execute sell orders. Let's talk about what was actually lost. Between September and November 1929, the stock market lost about 40% of its value, roughly $30 billion in market capitalization. That's about $500 billion in today's dollars. But it gets worse. The market would continue to fall. By July 1932, the Dow had lost 89% of its peak value. $89 billion in wealth, about $1.5 trillion today, simply evaporated. Behind those numbers were real people whose lives were destroyed. There was the secretary who had invested her $1,500 life savings. Gone. The shoe salesman who borrowed against his house. Foreclosed. The small-time investor who thought he was securing his retirement. Bankrupt. But it wasn't just small investors. Wealthy families saw fortunes disappear overnight. The Cutton family, one of the richest in Chicago, lost over $100 million. The banker Frank McNamara was found in his apartment, dead from gas poisoning. Suicide. He left a note. My body should go to science, my soul to Andrew W. Mellon, and sympathy to my creditors. So why did it crash? The simple answer, it had to. You cannot sustain an economy where wealth is generated through speculation rather than production. You cannot build prosperity on borrowed money and inflated asset prices. Eventually, reality catches up. The complex answer involves multiple factors. Overproduction. Factories were producing more goods than people could buy. Underconsumption. Most Americans didn't earn enough to buy all the goods being produced. Agricultural depression. Farmers had been struggling throughout the decade. Banking fragility. Banks were unregulated, over-leveraged, and interconnected. Income inequality. Wealth was so concentrated that consumption couldn't keep pace with production. The international gold standard made it impossible to use monetary policy to fight the downturn. But the fundamental cause was this. The prosperity of the 1920s was built on debt, speculation, and inequality. When confidence collapsed, the whole house of cards came down. Initially, leaders insisted everything would be fine. President Hoover declared, "The fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis." Bankers and economists assured the public this was just a correction, that the market would recover quickly, that the economy was strong. They were catastrophically wrong, because the crash wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The stock market crash triggered a cascade of failures that would drag the entire economy into the abyss. When stocks crashed, banks that had lent money for stock purchases couldn't collect. When they couldn't collect, they failed. When they failed, depositors lost their savings. When people lost their savings, they stopped spending. When they stopped spending, businesses failed. When businesses failed, workers lost their jobs. When workers lost their jobs, they couldn't make their installment payments. When they couldn't make payments, more businesses failed. It was a death spiral, and it was just getting started. What followed the crash wasn't just a recession, it was the complete collapse of the American economic system. This is the story of how the Roaring Twenties became the Great Depression, and how the party of the century led to the suffering of a generation. In 1930, the dominoes started to fall. In December, the Bank of United States, ironically a private bank, not a government institution, collapsed. It was the largest bank failure in American history up to that point, with over $200 million in deposits. 4,000 banks failed in 1930 alone. When a bank failed, there was no FDIC, no deposit insurance. Your life savings simply disappeared. Millions of Americans watched their financial security vanish overnight. In 1931, the crisis went global. The Austrian Creditanstalt Bank collapsed in May, triggering a banking panic across Europe. Britain abandoned the gold standard in September. International trade collapsed. It would eventually fall by 65% from its 1929 peak. Another 2,300 American banks failed in 1931. Unemployment, which had been 3% in 1929, reached 16% by the end of 1931. That's 1 in 6 workers without a job. 1932 was the worst year. Unemployment hit 24%. 1 in 4 workers couldn't find a job. Industrial production had fallen 46% from its 1929 peak. Construction had collapsed by 80%. Corporate profits had fallen 90%. Another 1,500 banks failed. Housing starts collapsed. Homelessness exploded. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles in bitter mockery of the president sprang up in every major city. Let me put a human face on these statistics. In 1932, a typical unemployed worker had been out of work for 18 months. Their savings, if they'd had any, were gone. Their credit was exhausted. Their furniture had been repossessed. Their landlord had evicted them. They were living with relatives if they were lucky, in a Hooverville shack if they weren't. They were eating at soup kitchens, standing in bread lines, taking any work they could find. A day's labor for a few cents, collecting scrap metal, selling apples on street corners. Yes, starvation. In America, in the 20th century. Children suffered from malnutrition and rickets. Families ate dandelion greens and whatever they could forage. Reports from hospitals documented cases of starvation, especially among children and the elderly. The Red Cross estimated that 20 million Americans were surviving on charity handouts. That's 1 in 6 people dependent on charity for basic survival. The house that middle-class families had bought with a mortgage? Foreclosed. By 1933, over 1,000 home foreclosures were happening every day. Families who had lived in their homes for years were evicted, their possessions piled on the sidewalk. Farmers faced the same fate. Crop prices had collapsed. Wheat that sold for $1 per bushel in 1929 was selling for 33 cents in 1932. Farmers couldn't pay their mortgages. Between 1930 and 1935, 750,000 farms were foreclosed, and then nature added insult to injury. In 1931, the rain stopped in the Great Plains. Years of over-farming had destroyed the topsoil. When the drought hit, the soil simply blew away in massive dust storms that darkened the sky. The Dust Bowl displaced 3.5 million people. Families packed everything they owned into rickety trucks and headed west to California, hoping for agricultural work. They found more poverty, more discrimination, more suffering. The Bonus Army. In the summer of 1932, 43,000 veterans of World War I marched on Washington, D.C. They were demanding early payment of bonuses they'd been promised for their military service. Bonuses not due until 1945. They were desperate. They were starving. President Hoover ordered the army to clear them out. General Douglas MacArthur led troops with tanks and tear gas against American veterans. The camps were burned. The veterans were dispersed. The image of the U.S. Army attacking its own veterans became a symbol of the government's failure. But perhaps the worst damage was psychological. An entire generation's belief in progress, in the future, in the American dream, was shattered. Men who had been proud workers, proud providers, now stood in breadlines, unable to feed their families. The suicide rate increased 20% between 1929 and 1933. Marriages were postponed. Birth rates dropped. People simply gave up hope. This is what the Roaring Twenties bought us, a decade of suffering that would scar an entire generation. President Herbert Hoover believed the government should not interfere in the economy. He believed the Depression would correct itself. He believed in rugged individualism, that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you don't have boots. Hoover's inaction, his insistence that prosperity was just around the corner, his belief that charity and volunteerism could solve systemic economic collapse, it all made him the most hated president in modern American history. By March 1933, the banking system was on the verge of complete collapse. Franklin D. Roosevelt, inaugurated on March 4th, immediately declared a banking holiday, a euphemism for shutting down the entire banking system for 4 days to prevent total collapse. When the banks reopened, only the solvent ones were allowed to operate. But the damage was done. The American economy had contracted by nearly 50% from its 1929 peak. It was the worst economic disaster in American history. So, what do we learn from the Roaring Twenties? Why does this matter nearly a century later? Because the pattern repeats. The names change, the technology changes, but the fundamental dynamics of boom, bubble, and bust remain the same. The first lesson is about inequality. By 1929, wealth was so concentrated at the top that the economy couldn't sustain itself. The bottom 80% didn't earn enough to buy the goods the economy was producing. This created a fundamental contradiction. Capitalism requires consumers, but if you don't pay workers enough to be consumers, the system collapses. The prosperity of the 1920s was eating its own seed corn. And here's the uncomfortable truth. By some measures, wealth concentration today is approaching 1929 levels. The top 1% owns about 40% of all wealth in America. We've learned this lesson before. We seem determined to relearn it. The second lesson is about debt. The prosperity of the 1920s was built on consumer credit, margin loans, and the assumption that tomorrow would always be better than today. But debt doesn't create wealth. It pulls future consumption into the present. When you buy a car on credit, you're not richer. You're committing future income to a present purchase. If that future income doesn't materialize, the debt becomes crushing. Today, American consumer debt exceeds $17 trillion. Student loans, credit cards, car loans, mortgages. We're running the same playbook as the 1920s, just with bigger numbers. The third lesson is about regulation. The stock market of the 1920s was a rigged casino where insiders manipulated prices, information was hidden, and small investors were systematically fleeced. After the crash, the government created the Securities and Exchange Commission, required disclosure of financial information, banned insider trading, and established rules to prevent market manipulation. These regulations worked. We didn't have another 1929-style crash for decades, but regulations only work if they're enforced. Every financial crisis since 1929, the savings and loan crisis, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 financial crisis, has followed the same pattern. Regulations are weakened, speculation increases, insiders profit, and eventually the bubble pops. The fourth lesson is about the social safety net. In the 1920s, if you lost your job, you starved. If you got sick, you went bankrupt. If you got old, you hoped your children could support you. After the Depression, America built a safety net: unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare, food assistance, and eventually the Affordable Care Act. These programs don't just help individuals, they stabilize the entire economy by maintaining consumption during downturns. Every political debate about cutting these programs should be informed by the memory of breadlines and Hoovervilles. We built the safety net for a reason. That reason hasn't disappeared. The fifth lesson is the most important. Prosperity that isn't shared isn't sustainable. An economy where a tiny elite lives like Gatsby while millions struggle to survive is not just immoral. It's unstable. The Roaring Twenties proves that you can't sustain an economy on luxury purchases by the wealthy. You need a broad middle class with enough income to be consumers. You need workers who can afford to buy the products they make. You need a society where success lifts everyone, not just the top. Look at America today and ask yourself, what do we share with the 1920s? Rising inequality? Check. Debt-fueled consumption? Check. Asset bubbles in stocks and real estate? Check. Political polarization and social division? Check. A belief that the good times will last forever? Check. We're not doomed to repeat the 1920s. We have tools they didn't have: Social Security, unemployment insurance, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve with expanded powers, stronger financial regulations. But we also have their mistakes available to us. We can choose to concentrate wealth at the top. We can choose to build prosperity on debt. We can choose to believe that markets regulate themselves and safety nets are unnecessary. The question is, will we? So let's return to the question we started with. What was the Roaring Twenties really? For the bottom 40% of Americans, the factory workers, the domestic servants, the tenant farmers, the African Americans fleeing Jim Crow, it was a decade of grinding poverty punctuated by fear and discrimination. The prosperity passed them by entirely. For the emerging middle class, the skilled workers, the office employees, the small business owners, it was a tantalizing taste of consumer comfort, bought on credit and resting on a foundation of sand. They got their cars and their radios, and then watched them repossessed during the Depression. For the wealthy elite, the financiers, the industrialists, the old money aristocrats, it was a golden age of unimaginable luxury and completely unearned wealth. They danced while Rome burned, and when the fire came, many of them had enough money left to survive. The cultural legacy of the 1920s is mixed. Yes, it gave us jazz, Art Deco, the lost generation literature, the birth of modern celebrity culture. It was a decade of genuine creativity and cultural innovation. But it also gave us Prohibition's organized crime, the KKK's mainstream respectability, the cynical manipulation of markets, and the hollow glamour of consumption as identity. Not all cultural legacies are worth celebrating. The economic legacy is clearer. The 1920s demonstrated in the most painful way possible what happens when an economy is built on inequality, speculation, and debt, rather than on shared prosperity and real production. It took World War II to finally end the depression that the 1920s created. 16 years of suffering, from 1929 to 1945, was the price paid for 10 years of fraudulent prosperity. Let's talk about the human cost. The generation that came of age in the 1920s, the young workers, the new middle class, the hopeful immigrants, had their lives destroyed. They spent their prime years in breadlines, their savings evaporated, their dreams deferred or destroyed. Many never recovered. The Depression scarred them psychologically for life. They became the generation that never threw anything away, that saved every penny, that never trusted banks or the stock market again. Can you blame them? Here's a thought experiment. What if America had made different choices in the 1920s? What if instead of allowing unlimited speculation, we'd regulated the stock market from the start? What if instead of concentrating wealth at the top, we'd paid workers enough to be real consumers? What if instead of building prosperity on debt, we'd built it on sustainable production and fair wages? We might have had slower growth in the short term. The parties might not have been as lavish. The mansions might not have been as grand. But we also might have avoided the depression. Millions of lives might have been better. The suffering might have been prevented. So here's my verdict on the Roaring Twenties. It was not a golden age. It was a cautionary tale about the consequences of greed, inequality, and delusion. It was a decade-long party thrown by the wealthy, paid for by the middle class, and crashed by reality. The bill was presented in October 1929, and an entire generation spent the 1930s paying it off. The real tragedy is that we learned the lessons. We reformed the banking system, regulated the markets, built a safety net, created a more broadly shared prosperity in the post-World War II era. And then slowly we forgot. We deregulated. We cut the safety net. We allowed inequality to return. We convinced ourselves that this time would be different, that we'd figured out how to have permanent prosperity without the crash. But the 1920s teaches us a timeless truth. Economic gravity always wins. Bubbles always pop. Inequality always creates instability. Debt always comes due, and parties always end. So when you see those images of the Roaring Twenties, the flappers, the jazz, the champagne, the glamour, remember what's outside the frame. Remember the tenements. Remember the Hoovervilles. Remember the bread lines. And remember that every time someone tells you that regulation is unnecessary, that markets regulate themselves, that wealth will trickle down, that prosperity is permanent, they're selling you the same lie that was sold in the 1920s. The morning after always comes. The only question is whether we'll be prepared for it.